I am going to move us along and introduce Marisa Gerstein Pineau, who's a PhD sociologist who works now with the Frameworks Institute and has been working with us to develop this diabetes specific framing brief based on the research that they've conducted, and is going to lead us through a workshop to really roll up our sleeves and dig deeper into this framing approach. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Marisa, and thank you so much for joining us. And I'm really looking forward to learning from what you're going to be sharing today.
Okay, so this is our brief agenda. So I'm going to start with very quickly with why framing, because Nat did such a good job of setting them up. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what we're communicating into, what are the traps we tend to fall into when we're communicating in this and other areas. And then I believe we're going to have another quiz and some time to do Q&A and a break, and then we'll get deep into the framing recommendations from the strategic brief. So real quick on why is framing, just to remind you, frames are sets of choices that we make whenever we're communicating about what we're emphasizing, how we're explaining things, what we say, and sometimes what we leave unsaid. And these choices and how we're presenting information then affect how people think, how they feel about an issue, and eventually how they act. So for instance, how they might support programs or policies that would help people who have diabetes or would help everyone with their health. So I think something that Nat didn't really talk about, or didn't talk about much, that's really fascinating for this particular group is not only does framing affect how people think about an issue or how they understand it or what they support, it's that when you have a shared framing strategy, it can really amplify your message. So a lot of times what we see in any particular field, and this is not just specific to diabetes, trust me, is you have a lot of different groups with a lot of different messages. And some of those messages might actually be saying a different thing than others. And what happens is that these mixed messages make it really hard for people to understand what it is that they should know, or what their attitudes are supposed to be, or what they should be supporting. And ultimately, if there's all this different stuff going on, all these different maybe counter messages, people kind of check out. They're not sure what they're supposed to know. So when you have a shared framing strategy and you get everybody going in the same direction and sharing the same ways of talking about an issue, and that doesn't mean you're all saying the exact same thing, it's that you're using the sort of same basis for your messages that you know are going to work well, then you can really educate the public. That's where you can start tackling attitudes. And it also creates connections between all of these organizations that are trying to talk about the same thing. So it's sort of like a virtuous circle. It really brings the organizations together and amplifies the message. So I want to show you an example of this from our Reframing Aging project. And as you can see, it was sponsored by a whole bunch of organizations in the aging space that all recognized that they had this shared challenge around talking about aging, around improving attitudes about aging, amongst other things, including fighting ageism and making sure that we have a world in which people can really age well. So the way that they reframe their communications, the way we recommended it based on really a deep pool of research that we did, is one, which again, Nat talked about, was moving away from this idea that older people or seniors are vulnerable and are in decline, and that's why we should care about aging, but instead talking about aging as a dynamic process where we continue to move forward and need to have the supports and the communities that allow that dynamic process to happen. And instead of using sort of a sympathy or even a pity frame, you know, we should care about older people because they're our grandparents, et cetera. And it's not that that's a bad thing to say, but what it does is it reinforces negative ways of thinking about aging and getting older that people who work in this field and all of us don't want people to think about, right? and instead framing it as a justice issue. So, you know, older people living in isolation aren't people we should pity. This is a case of social justice. And our research showed that frame really worked for talking about helping older people live better lives and also preventing elder mistreatment. So after we did this, you know, all of this research over 2 or 3 years, and we made these recommended frames, these organizations were really great about writing opinion pieces, about reaching out to the American Geriatric Society, and getting this into the discourse. Like, let's talk about aging in this different way through the organizations and through the sort of major media outlets that would have some influence on more generally how people are thinking and talking about aging. And this led to changes in thinking. So it wasn't just an opinion piece in the Kansas City Star. Allure magazine started changing the language that they used around aging. And all of this actually happened very quickly. So because these organizations were so consistent and working together, I think that aging project ended 4 years ago, and Allure made this change a year ago. So that really can show you the power of working together with a framing strategy. So I think the sort of basis for any of the work that we do is understanding what it is that people are already thinking about a particular issue, so that you can create frames that you know are going to work. So most communication strategies, and this is how we're a little different than a lot of other organizations, start from the assumption that if people don't know about the particular thing you're communicating about, so if people don't know about diabetes, they're basically empty fish bowls or tabula rasa, right? Like, they just don't have any information. And so if you give them information, they're going to understand it the way that you do. And it's as simple as that. But what we know from social science research is that is not the way that human cognition works. We actually have a lot of things in our minds already that we bring to the discussion of any social issue, of anything actually, that already have, you know, preconceived assumptions, ideas. We're already making meaning of whatever we see. And we call these cultural models. So this is actually a term from anthropology. Nat probably mentioned it. He's an anthropologist. And I work with a number of anthropologists, but other social sciences use different words for this. And they help us process information. So they're the sort of culture in mind, as we call it, that are already there when you're talking about any particular issue and that people use to make sense of it. So these are assumptions, they're beliefs that come from our experiences, that come up from our expectations. They come from the culture that we are constantly surrounded by and that are often embedded in the structures that we're living in. And what's interesting about them is that they're just usually very top of mind. You say a word to somebody, you say diabetes to somebody, and they have an instant reaction. Actually, in my breakout group right now, some people talked about that and the reactions they get when they talk about the fact that they have diabetes. So because these cultural models are so sort of ingrained, and I don't want to say they're impossible to move around, and I'm not going to say there's one set of them, because actually we all have a lot of cultural models in our minds that we can draw on when we're thinking and talking about any particular topic. And sometimes they come in direct conflict with one another. You know, knowing what's there before you start communicating is really important. So I am going to show a video. Of course, we are on Zoom. I am hoping this works really well. It worked great when we tested it yesterday, but if for some reason it doesn't, I will, please, Matthew, just let me know, and I will summarize what is in the video. It won't be nearly as fun, but let's take it away and see how it works.
What would you say shapes how healthy or unhealthy someone is?
Their diet.
You know, eating the right types of foods.
Working out and making sure you're making healthier decisions while you're eating.
Diet and exercise and sleep.
I mean, it's common sense. You go to the doctor.
A lot of people put off going to the doctor.
Your company can offer you the best healthcare in the world, but if you never go to the doctor or you avoid your problems, then...
I think your health-wise, it just depends how you active, eating, playing, that kind of thing.
Core values. Why are people 300 pounds?
Okay.
Because they eat stuff they shouldn't, they don't exercise.
Right.
And they don't look after themselves.
Some people make their lives more difficult by the decisions that they make.
Individual choices.
Some people, I think, make their own trouble.
They should also try and help themselves, too. I think they shouldn't try and play the victim card.
People have to help themselves.
Personal choice, the choices they make.
Negligence, mostly.
Just not treating your body like a temple.
Some people just don't care about their health.
Health is something that you have to be accountable to yourself for.
You can lead the horse to water, but you can't make the horse drink.
Exposures to bad environments.
Places that some people can afford are places that really you have to decide, you know, your life is in danger being there sometimes.
And a lot of your lower income communities are food deserts, and you don't have good full service grocery store.
So that actually is a compilation of videos from a lot of different projects that we've done around health over the years. And as you saw, we hear the same things over and over. And I know from our conversation yesterday and from the breakout group today that these are things all of you hear over and over and over again. It's about diet, it's about exercise. Some people don't want to go to the doctor. Some people have bad values. But what was really interesting is that even though so many people started with that one way of thinking, that sort of very individualistic, personal responsibility way of thinking that we know leads to attitudes, negative attitudes and stigma. I want us to keep in mind that right there at the very end, people started talking about where you live, about what's available, about food deserts and living in unsafe communities. So that kind of thinking, that sort of we call systems thinking or contextual thinking, is available to people. It's out there. It's more recessive. Sometimes it takes people a longer time to sort of dig into that kind of thinking, but we want to make sure that that's what we're activating whenever we're framing. We want to move people away from that individualism and help them, you know, dig a little deeper and get to that thinking about place matters and what's available to us matters. And it's what's available and where we live for all of us, right? So it's not just about individuals, it's about the systems that all of us live in. So we'll talk about that a little more when we talk about the recommendations. So understanding how people think, which is what we just saw. We saw kind of two major ways of thinking as our individual thinking and systems thinking, helps us choose the right frames. And that's what we do at Frameworks, and that's how we start with any of our research before we start developing frames. So just something to keep in mind. This is what you're up against, and this is what you're communicating into. And if you can find those places where people think in productive ways, then you've already done an amazing job. So that's the sort of thing that we want to think about as we're talking about these recommendations. So, yeah. So now we're going to talk about communications traps. And I just want to be clear, these are traps that exist across basically every project that I have ever worked on. Some of them might be a little more common in health, but that's not necessarily the truth, true for everything. And they are so, you're going to recognize, I think, all of these, but they're so common that we don't even realize they're traps. We just think, oh, this is the way you tell a story or start a narrative about any social issues. So the first is myth busting, and I'm going to show you a sort of classic study on why you shouldn't myth bust. The other is offering people unframed data, so just kind of throwing data out there and asking people to make sense of it. And the third is crisis messaging. So myth busting, you probably recognize some version of this sort of myth fact sheet. They're very common, particularly in health, although I've seen them in others. And it's, you know, the basic idea that you tell people what the myth is or what the wrong thing to think is. And then you tell them the thing that's true, that they, you know, the actual fact. And this is a very common setup, but several studies now have shown that this is actually counterproductive a lot of times. So a study from 2005 showed that, first of all, there's an ordering problem. People remember what they read first. So when you do myth fact, people remember the myth as the true thing. They actually found when they followed up with people, you know, like weeks and months afterwards, that it got worse over time. More people remembered the myths as true than vice versa. So the myths really stuck with them. And the kicker to all of this is that people attributed the false information to the CDC because that is who was sponsoring this myth fact sheet. So it like basically kind of blew up in their faces in every way you can imagine. And so I think, you know, staying away from this is really important, and it's very pervasive. So the other is that we provide more data instead of framing our data. And so we see this all the time with scientists and researchers where you give people some numbers, they don't seem to get it, you provide some pretty charts and tables. If they just hear it more, like if they see more evidence, they're gonna get it. And then they're gonna have an epiphany. They're gonna be just like you. They're gonna understand the problem. And again, and I come from the world of academia, so I see this all the time. And the data speaks for itself is actually a term that I read on Twitter way too often. And we know, again, from understanding human cognition, that just giving people numbers doesn't necessarily work to convince them of the thing you want them to understand, because you're not communicating into a vacuum or an empty fishbowl. People already have ways of understanding that they're going to bring to this discussion. So Nat talked about this yesterday, which is using data about vulnerability around COVID, and particularly by race. So I actually did research in May with a bunch of different focus groups on Zoom, which was interesting, where we showed them basically almost exactly this piece of data about the difference in hospitalization between Black patients and white patients who have COVID. And here's examples of some of how people responded to this information. Well, maybe more people smoke who are Black. You know what? I'm part African American, but I know in my community that sometimes people don't sign up their kids for healthcare, but they'll sign up for welfare. So really like stigmatizing stereotypes about Black communities that came from somebody who was Black, which I thought was really fascinating. And then this was data from the CDC. And so this is a new thing that we're all really facing is, I don't believe the CDC. I don't trust science. I don't trust our government. And so you can see how just giving people data, they made sense of it using all these other understandings. That was not the intention of the data, which was there's a problem going on, you know, in terms of race and COVID, and Black Americans are being hospitalized at a higher rate. And maybe there's a systemic problem, but that's not what people heard when they just saw the data. And the last one is what we call crisis messaging. And I'm sure all of you have seen this, and I'm actually going to show an example later that explicitly is from some communications by a diabetes organization. And the problem with crisis messaging is, again, it can be really counterproductive because it makes people feel like we're in a sense of crisis, but it sort of overshoots urgency and pushes people towards not being able to care or fatalism. So this, of course, is an example from climate change. I have to say, I often don't read news about climate change for exactly this reason. It's really upsetting and it's hard for me to process. So in general, crisis framing faces what Stephen Gardner calls the finite pool of worry. We are only capable of worrying so much. And since we have this limited capacity for the kind of worry that would actually motivate action, we kind of end up focusing on one thing or another, and it becomes a zero-sum game. I can't worry about everything. And of course, we know right now, we have a lot of things to worry about, right? So diabetes is definitely competing with a lot of other very crisis situations. And although it is a crisis, it's, you know, we're communicating again into this finite pool. So another aspect of this is that if everything is a crisis, well, then what's a real crisis? I can't decide because you're telling me everything is so important that I should freak out about it, right? And then it also pushes people towards fatalism. If it's a crisis, there's probably nothing I can do. So thinking really hard about how you talk about a particular issue and raising the urgency without making people feel like it's a crisis that they have to add to all the other crises that they're worrying about and that, you know, kind of gets swept under the rug or that they think they can do nothing about is really important. So I think now is the time for us to do some Q&A. Was the plan to do it in the chat box and then
I can kick off a couple that I was tracking from the chat that already came in, Marissa, and then additional questions, let's throw those in the chat box now. But one really simple logistical one was, are your slides going to be shared? Because I think a lot of people want to study this more.
I was thinking about this. Yeah, I just need to add a little brand to them that's not so attractive when you're presenting, but works for when you're sending them out, and I can send them out later.
Awesome. And then the other one on the myth busting reframe, somebody was asking if you've studied FAQs and if there's any similar phenomena with FAQs.
Yeah. We have not studied FAQs ourselves. I'd be really curious to see if anybody has. I mean, I don't think that they would necessarily be problematic in the way that myth busting does, because if you're not providing inaccurate information, that's the real issue with myth busting. But there might be some studies on this that I haven't seen.
Okay, great. And then one other one that I saw from Dr. Gavin, is there evidence of a difference in impact from messaging, including myth busting, when it's derived from a trusted or credible relationship?
Yeah, so we have done testing on messengers, and other people have definitely done testing on messengers, and it makes a difference. You want to have somebody, ideally you have somebody who is trusted and legitimate in the eyes of the people who are reading the communications. I'm not sure if there's anything that combined myth busting and messengers. It's definitely interesting. I think now that the CDC was very trusted on matters of public health. And when that study came out was 2005. I don't think that's a specific aspect, but there is quite a bit of more recent studies on the impact of scientific authority on messages. So if you have it, you know, coming from an epidemiologist or a doctor, et cetera, that can make a difference, but it often interacts with other aspects of that particular topic. So interestingly, we did some work on talking to mostly parents, most of whom were people of color, about being involved in scientific research around toxic stress. And there was a definite marked lack of trust for medical professionals because of the long history of, you know, medicine, you know, the Tuskegee Institute and HELAC, et cetera. So, you know, that's something to very much take into consideration whenever you are testing your frames in a really contested space like that.
Okay, we've got lots of questions coming in now. One that I caught on the data reframe one. If more data is not the answer, is there a best practice and how to utilize data?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the more data thing is that people throw data out there and think, well, it's not because they don't understand, they don't necessarily recognize that the problem isn't the data, it's that you didn't frame the data. So they think that, well, if I show them a chart for these numbers, then they'll get it. Or, you know, if I find some other way of portraying the data. But the issue isn't that you shouldn't use data. You should absolutely use data. But what you have to do is give people the tools they need to understand it before you present it or while you're presenting it. So as you saw in that slide where we kind of gave, you know, just information, ideally factual from the CDC, information about disparities in race and COVID hospitalizations. And because it didn't say somewhere in there, preferably at the beginning, because of systemic racism or discrimination in healthcare or lack of access to health insurance, we're seeing these disparities, or we think that's why we think people just went back to sort of their assumptions about why, you know, Black people might not have as good a health as white people. And those are usually, you know, based on judgments, particularly racial or racist judgments about Black people and health. So it's about explaining and giving people the tools they need to understand it the way that you understand it as a researcher or a scientist or an advocate.
Yeah.
Can I offer a question verbally, or do we have to put them through chat?
Yeah, go ahead, David.
This is Dave Marrero. I run a Center for Border Health Research, okay? And you've made two important points, and I want to add to it because I think this is really important to me. One is that social determinants are an enormous factor in this game, as well as personal decision-making. We oftentimes think of ourselves, I have diabetes, that I control what I do. You know, a doctor can tell me anything they want, but I'm the one who implements it. All true, but there are many social determinants that have to be accounted for. But in the conversation we were just having, there's a feeling I'm getting that the assumption here is that we can use one type of message or one structure or approach and it will fit all the sizes, and it won't. So where I live, it's all Hispanic, Mexican origin people. And if I don't address cultural norms, cultural mores and belief systems, use of food and rituals and family structure and a bunch of other stuff, I'm dead. I don't care how good my data is, how good my charts are, or how carefully I explain it to somebody. And just last point, for those of you that are doing stuff with Mexican or Hispanic or Latinx, whatever, choose your term, you want to do, translating stuff that was written in English for a different cultural audience into Spanish is not cultural tailoring. Sorry, I just had to put that in.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great point. And I think, you know, this is something that I always want to emphasize, which is, there are many ways in which you can use the underlying idea of a frame to match it to your audience. So culture is, particularly the culture of people who are coming from another country, is incredibly important because they don't share the same, I shouldn't say they don't share at all, but their culture is different from America. So when we do our research, we do it with people who either were born in this country or have been here since they were 10, which limits the extent to which we can make recommendations about how you would translate something into Spanish, for instance. But I think those are both really excellent points that you have to take into account.
James Corbett had a question he wanted to ask out loud, and I know we have so many good ones in the chat box as well, so I'm thanks for your patience for those who are waiting.
Thanks, Brooke. Marisa, great presentation. So just a question, particularly on that video we saw, the language of kind of personal responsibility. You know, to me, I'm sensing a certain kind of religious undertone there, this kind of personal responsibility. I also see this kind of notion of this, I think it's a misinterpretation of constitutional rights, this individual choice tied to our rugged individualism in this country. You see it a lot with the mask. So are you tying any of this back to theories tied to religion or theories tied to this kind of individualism versus kind of communitarian perspective?
Yeah, so I mean, 100% and this is what I get sometimes for like trying to compress things, but definitely this is rooted in our individualistic culture in America. And it comes from many different sources, religion, Calvinism, the idea that we have individual rights that are based in the Enlightenment. All of those things have continued to appear in American culture, and they affect what we think about everything, every social issue. It's how we make meaning about any human activity. There's actually been some studies that show that the United States is the most individualistic culture in the world, second in only by the UK, which probably isn't a surprise considering that that's sort of part of where our government, a big part of where our government and culture came from. So yeah, absolutely. And actually we're having a discussion, our breakout group, about, where does some of this stigma about diabetes and making personal choices come from? And, I was saying it goes back to gluttony and moral, judgments about people. It's deeply rooted in Christianity. So it just goes to show how, culture can change, but it also can stay very consistent for a very, very long time.
Yeah. So I'm going to try to combine a couple of these questions that address social determinants of health. Dennis from IDEO is asking about, when you showed that video, how the conversation started to go there and started to get into those social determinants of health. Mm-hmm. How are you, and then there's also a question in here, the COVID example, which could have a social determinant of health answer, but people's first response isn't. So how do you help people kind of break through those initial filters and steer people toward those more really social determinants and equity oriented responses and frames?
Yeah, I mean, that's what we do, right? So we see how people, the ideas and the meaning making that people have available to them, and we find the ones that are sort of the most, we call them productive, in terms of messaging to help people understand equity, to help people understand the role of social structures and discrimination. And so when we're testing frames, we're creating frames with those things in mind. So what are the frames that we can use that will cue those ways of thinking? And then, once we've discovered what those are through the research we do quantitative research, we do qualitative research, making sure that our partners, our, advocates, researchers, et cetera, are using those frames over and over again, because that kind of the sort of more complex, place matters, or what surrounds you shapes you, ways of thinking are there, but people aren't necessarily used to using them. So it's sort of like a muscle, right? You have to help people practice using that way of thinking over and over again so they build up their systems muscle, is one of the ways that we think about it. And we do find that can be really helpful for changing the way people think.
And I think our brief gets at that a little bit too, with sort of defining the terms when we're going to talk about equity, right? Because that was one of the points in the brief that we had in the pre-reader.
Sorry, I have children and cats, everybody in the house wants to like jump on top of me right now. So.
Perfect timing in the middle of Q&A where you're having to think on your feet.
I do want to make a comment though, that as much as I am involved with social determinants, which is everything at the border, trust me, it's an enormous issue. Not everything is social determinants. So there's sort of a flavor I'm getting where this is the way we should do it now. We shouldn't do other things. It should be about equity and social determinants and external factors. And I think it has a lot to do with the cohort that you're addressing, the people you're going after. Because what I do with Mexican origin people that live in downtown Tucson is way different than what I do with people that live in Nogales, which is only 50 miles south of here, but it might as well be on the other side of the moon because of all the distance issues and ecology and a bunch of other stuff. So I want to caution us to not think that it's wrong to talk about individual choice, or it's wrong to talk about trade-offs or impact on family or a bunch of other stuff. And what I'm hearing sort of is this flavoring of like, well, it's about equity, it's about determinants. And I'm amazed I'm saying this because all I deal with is social determinants in health with Mexican origin, immigration populations. But we have to be careful. It's about tailoring your message to the audience that you want to address it to. And that could be different. It can be different. And I love the cap, by the way. It could be different from group to group. You know what I mean? So don't walk away from this thinking, well, she told us this is what we were doing was wrong and this is right, because I don't think it's that simple, guys. I really don't.
Well, and I absolutely agree. And I think people do have to make personal choices, right? When it comes to diabetes, absolutely. Like, but if we want to tackle stigma, we need to find ways for people to also think about sort of the fact that they're not others, right? Because when we talk about personal choices, that can lead very quickly to, well, those people made the wrong choices and so they got what they deserved. But also making sure that people understand that there are ways, in addition to making personal choices, to make all of us healthier, like having better healthcare, like having safe spaces for people to exercise, like having affordable, healthy food. So I don't think it's an either or, but I do think it's a matter of focus. Stigma is what we want to be taking care of.
Yeah, and this is a great piece, because it does seem like there's nuance here for people to grapple with more when we do our breakouts. In terms of timing, I think I'm going to ask you one more question, Marisa, and then we'll take our break. And the last question, just to touch on one of the other points that we haven't talked about yet, was around the crisis and urgency one. So, there's, let me make sure I got the right. Oops, did I not get that right? But how can you acknowledge that crisis is real in a way that doesn't create the shutdown response, is the essence of the question.
Yeah, no, and that's, I think the important thing is not asserting that something is a crisis up front, which again is like sort of our headline grabber. We actually worked with the homelessness organization whose name was Crisis. But what we found is not only do people get that sort of crisis fatigue, but also that while it might engage them right away, it doesn't, over time, that dissipates. But if you start by telling people this is a problem that we can tackle together, and it's urgent and it's a problem, but help people see how they can be actively involved in it, that's really critical. Because otherwise, yeah, you're risking that like fatalism, or I can't really care about this thing now. But people actually get excited when they see a place or a thing that they can do to help something that is an urgent problem. So yeah, again, it's sort of an ordering thing.
Awesome. Well, I think part of what we're getting out of this Q&A is that this is an art. There's a lot of nuance, and we want to root things first in what we know from science, but then that crafting part of the process, which is what we're going to start playing with after the break, is really where the rubber hits the road.
Okay, so I am going to dive into the more specific recommendations or sort of shifts that we want to make in the way that we communicate and frame diabetes and people with diabetes, so that we can move attitudes in more positive directions. And then we're going to have this great breakout group conversation where you can really dive into this. So I'm excited to see what comes out of that. But so these are sort of the fundamental shifts that we're doing from and to, and I really feel like the big one that we need that are sort of the center of all of this is moving from those people, so people with diabetes, and to all of us, you know, and making sure that our shared humanity is a big part of the conversation, so we can stop the othering that goes on, which I've learned a lot more about just from the past, you know, day and a half. Another part of this is describing what stigma is we've discovered across a lot of projects is pretty problematic. So instead of asserting stigma, is to talk about implicit or unconscious bias and how that works. So moving from a description to an explanation. We already talked about myth busting, but I think that this is, you know, a really important one to keep in mind in talking about facts first, instead of just stating that there are inequities. And this is a problem across a lot of different fields. And we've encountered it in a lot of different places. And what we found is that pretty simply explaining equity goes a very long way, but is very rarely done. And then crisis messaging, as I talked about, you know, starting with and helping people understand collective solutions is a really important part of moving this conversation. So I'm just going to take these one by one. I don't want to take up too much time, and I know that probably most of you have already read the framing brief, which has some more details in it, but I just want to go quickly over each of them and then show you an example. So the first, of course, is that sort of meta frame in a way of talking about what we all need to be healthy while still discussing the specific targeted needs of people with diabetes. So, you know, what we know is that people think in these super individualistic blame and shame ways. And so what we need to do is move people away from those people and towards all of us. And this is, I just think that this is really critical, and we've seen it work when talking about a number of different social issues. So things like aging, adolescence, which we just finished, foster care, et cetera. So in other sort of stigmatized groups, this has worked. So this is really interesting. And I'm guessing all of you have seen this. I used it as an example in the framing brief. Almost these all talk about how you need to take control of your diabetes, and all you have to do is decide. And so I think this must have been a campaign that originated somewhere influential, because it was like in website after website after website. And what this does is it puts it all on the person who has diabetes. And so you have to take control and you have to decide. And if you don't decide, then that's your problem. And very stigmatizing type of message, even though, you know, obviously it was created in a way to help people with diabetes. So instead of, for Diabetes Awareness Month, telling people you have to take control and you need to avoid eating poorly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And again, which from our earlier conversation, people with diabetes do need to you know, think about their diet and exercise, et cetera. But that can't be the sole focus if we want to tackle stigma. And it shouldn't be the sole focus anyway, because there are other social determinants that lead to people having diabetes, and we can bring those more to the fore. But talking instead about our shared humanity, what we all need to stay healthy, the fact that we need, you know, things like safe places to exercise and affordable, healthy food and really good preventative healthcare, is, you know, all of us need that regardless of whether or not we have diabetes. When we have diabetes, we need these more targeted treatments and care, but we should have access to all these things that everyone should have access to before. So that's the way I reframed that one. So talking about actually showing, explaining, not just telling people what stigma is, and talking about unconscious bias. So, you know, what people think is that stigma doesn't exist, or it's just not that much of a problem. And, you know, this is a big barrier. Telling people that stigma, you know, there is stigma, feels very blamey to them. I don't want to admit that I'm stigmatizing somebody. I haven't seen anybody else stigmatize people with diabetes. So why are you even saying this to me? Instead, if you explain to people, and we've seen this across a lot of projects, what unconscious bias is, and more importantly, where it comes from, you can really help people understand the origins of stigma and then see what it is that we can do collectively to change attitudes and make sure that stigma doesn't exist. So this was an example of kind of before and after that I chose. And again, I should say all of the things that I'm using as examples are drawn directly from or are very closely based on things that I found online just by searching diabetes. So these are like the things that popped up first on Google search. So the very first sentence of this is, few other diseases carry the social stigma of diabetes. When I first read that, I was like, really? I mean, I can think of a lot of other things that I think carry more of a social stigma. I am learning that it's much more important than I ever realized. But just telling me that made me say, I don't even want to read the rest of this message because I don't believe that it's true. So talking about what leads to that stigma, we're constantly exposed to these images, which takes the sort of location of the stigma out of me and into our culture and our social situation. So it's less kind of attacking and more showing people what the context is that might lead to them having these particular attitudes. So again, the myth busting problem that I talked about before, which I did see this when I was looking for examples around diabetes. So, you know, people think the myth is true. Try not to repeat the myth. If you do, don't do it first, you know, put it lower down in your communication. And so this is an example of something that I found that actually the data on the side of it was actually cited diaTribe, although I had to cut that part off. But so it's just a classic myth fact structure, and saying, you know, upfront, people with type 2 diabetes cause their disease. People just walk away thinking that. I mean, I almost didn't even see the myth when I first looked at it. It took me a second. So thinking about how you can present accurate information instead of starting with that myth is really important. And giving them, you know, more information. It's age, it's race, and genetics that also play a role, not to mention gestational diabetes. And this is all stuff that was actually further down in the website that I just moved up. And then I mentioned that there are myths, but not until after I've already set up the information and explanation that I want people to know. So making sure that equity is always explained and that people understand what inequities are, what equity is, and what equitable solutions are, because a lot of times we'll see stuff about equitable solutions, but not make it clear what those are addressing. So the main problem here, and again, across different fields, and it's something that we struggle with in framing a lot of frameworks, is that people think equity is equality. And we know that that's not true, but the American people have no idea what the difference is unless you explain it very, very, very clearly. And then if you don't, they won't, you know, support equitable solutions because they don't know what you're solving for. So this is one, again, I found it on a popular diabetes or an influential diabetes website that was talking about specifically COVID-19 and the ways in which it's really highlighting health inequities and making them worse. But because it doesn't define inequity, it's difficult for people to understand what you're talking about. So this is another reframe where I took what was already actually in the previous, so it's talking about glaring examples of racial injustice or casting a bright light on an old problem in America. I actually moved that part up and then gave people information about health inequities and what they are and why they happen. So they happen because of limited access to quality healthcare, inequity comes from racist interactions and higher rates of exposure to air pollutants, et cetera. So, you know, the explanation, we can kind of never underestimate the power of explanation. And what's fascinating is how often we forget to provide it to people. And you can do it in ways that might be a little bit longer, but it doesn't have to be a whole nother paragraph. You just need to think strategically about where you place the information. And then the last one, which we talked about some, was in the questions, et cetera, was about crisis and how we can talk about the importance of something without cueing those fatalistic ways of thinking or that sort of zero sum. I don't have room for that crisis in my head, and how we can talk about it in a different way that also, again, brings us back to that like collective responsibility. How can we all do this together? So, you know, if you show people how we can all solve important social problems, you're going to prevent them from going towards the individualistic stigma thinking, and you're going to prevent them from thinking in these very individualistic ways, while still talking about how this is an important problem. So this was another example I found where it's one of those assertions about something being a crisis or something being the worst stigma, you know, the most stigmatized thing, where when you make an assertion like that, when people don't, you know, already have ways of thinking that don't easily, for lack of a better word, jive with this information, you're going to push them away. They're not going to read the rest of your communications, or they're just going to misunderstand it. So saying that diabetes may be the most serious public health crisis of our time, that might be true. I'm not saying that it isn't a crisis, but for communication, that isn't a great way to start off. Instead, talking about how it's serious, it's urgent, it's important, but it's solvable, brings people into the conversation instead of sort of pushing them away. So that was my very quick review of what was in the framing brief. I didn't want to take too much time because I want to give everybody a lot of time in the breakout groups. So I actually have the questions on the slides, but we also, they will be in the Google Docs that everybody is using. So I'll just show you very quickly what we're going to be doing. So we're going to start off with the positive. So what is it that excites people about what we've been talking about today, and also what Nat talked about yesterday? And I have some sub questions here about like what made the biggest impact on you, what do you find useful? Let's start thinking about our audiences, and you know, what if this frame really resonates or seems to work well, like who would I use it with, and how would I do that? And then the second question, let's sort of dig into what we have questions about and what we find challenging and what would be helpful when it comes to using this strategy, because when we meet again, we're going to talk about that and debrief and see how people did with things. And I think it would be really helpful to know what folks are finding challenging before they go out and use some of the frames. And then we're going to ask everybody to do a little writing of their own and write up some talking points using a frame or frames. And then we will come back together and have a conversation. I hung out with the broccoli room and heard a lot of really interesting conversation about all of that that they were talking about, which a lot of it was about audiences and sort of coming back to where stigma is coming from and how to talk to, the pod, school day is over, the pod is in full effect. So it might be a little loud, but yeah, so I guess one thing I'm really curious about is the sort of, particularly the things that people found the most sort of effective and easy to use and that really resonated with them. And what it was that people found most challenging, because I'm curious about whether or not there are particular patterns in regards to that. So I don't know if it's easier to just do it in the chat or raise hands.
It'd be nice to get some voices in the space and just reminding everybody that brevity is our friend on large group calls. So anybody who feels like they'd like to share or ask a question out loud, let's make a little space for that. And I see a lot coming in the chat as well.
That's really
Yeah, so
Just go ahead.
all right, I was just say, so for the broccoli group, and we all like broccoli, by the way. My wife is frowning in the background.
Why is it a broccoli group?
Well, they're vegetables.
Those are
Anyway,
the breakout names.
Let me. One of the things that we concluded was that the appreciation that amongst healthcare professionals in the diabetes field, that stigma actually is a major issue in dealing with this disease may not be as pervasive as we think it should be in order to begin to change the narrative and the dialogue. And that we have an opportunity, and I'm going to specifically point to Bob Gabay, who I know is on the call, saying that we may be able to take this question and address it at the next scientific session by raising its profile and having in whatever kind of session, including with questionnaires of people that are registering for the meeting about the issue of stigma, that would give us greater insight so that we could target more effectively the approaches that we take to address the problem. That was number one. The other was a bit of uncertainty about how best to define implicit bias, and the fact that, again, clinicians may not, or almost certainly not, aware that they are responsible for episodes of implicit bias on a daily basis, and we need to give them some cues and clues and language to address these issues. And I'll stop there.
I'll just add to that. Yeah, I mean, absolutely true. I don't think it's on most providers' radar, and I think there are a number of different ways that we can not only put it on their radar, get them to understand it, but even more importantly, realize the impact it has on their ability to connect with their patients and ultimately get the kind of outcomes that I think most want to have. They're just they've thrown their hands up and don't realize that the harm they're doing.
Thanks, Bob. So you're going to take this on, right?
I will take it on with the team. Yeah, absolutely. But I think they're going to. This is. I mean, we'll talk about implementation, I expect, later. But I think there are multiple ways to reach out to the different communities, and I think your suggestion's one of them. But I think there's a whole host of ways.
Agreed.
It's going to require a pretty significant, from the provider side, pretty significant awareness raising piece first, and then solutions.
Yep. Great. Thank you.
I think Carl wanted to chime in as well, and I see a couple other hands, so it's great. So we've got Carl, and then we'll go David, Dennis. And if anybody else wants to speak out loud, if you use the reaction button at the bottom in the participant panel, that's a helpful way for us to help facilitate. And then Marisa will chime in with responses as needed, but this is a great chance just to get some discussion happening here. So Carl first, and then David will be next.
Yeah, very quickly, we talked a lot about the show frame, and I think one of the things that's important that keeps coming back to me behind that frame, it's very powerful, but Joan Gary built a machine to do all that advocacy. It wasn't just a couple of people sitting in an office. It was a machine that took a lot of work, a lot of data, a lot of phone calls, a lot of person time. And so I think one of the challenges about the show don't tell is not only can we use that thinking in our messaging, but if you want to actualize it, it takes a lot of resources.
Thanks, Carl. David.
Sure. So for our group, there were a lot of storytellers in our group, and so we certainly loved show, don't tell as a technique, and we believed in that, in sort of seeing individuals going through their life. But actually, when we got to the messaging piece, I think there's a lot of momentum around togetherness, number 5. And we actually had this almost a budding campaign, this idea of like, we all care, right? Meaning people with diabetes also care about their health, right? So that people are, we are all working hard to be healthy, right? So sort of going right into the face of some of the stereotypes of like they chose that actually people, in particular, if you look at the obesity space, people who are obese or have weight issues, like they tend to spend a disproportionate amount of time thinking about, struggling with, concerned with what they eat and what they're doing, right? That actually, it can be a preoccupying factor. But if you can see people making healthy choices and caring, this notion of we all care also puts us in position of like, yes, I, David, care about my health. I have diabetes and I care about my health, but you can also see people who don't have diabetes and care about their health because they know it's a risk. And this notion then we all care about each other, right? Because we have this individualistic society. So there might be a way to play it as like also defying the odds, right? Thinking about Jim Gavin's conversation around like, oh, maybe like the old conversation about diabetes isn't what we have today. So also it's like, I'm going to beat the odds because I care about my health and I know I can beat this thing, so that we're all heroes. Gives you the way to see individuals that make up this larger picture. So there's a pretty rich conversation, but I think that's sort of a summary. We really like this notion of how we are together and what we share. And yet you need individuals to sort of carry that message, right? And to, this also, people are hard to hate up close. That idea, it's like, as you get close to people, stigma can be reduced because you see people living their lives, making the right choices despite the odds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, David. Dennis Boyle next, and then Emily Fitz has a hand up after. And again, people can engage with what's being said out loud in the chat as well, doing a hybrid talk out loud and chat dialogue here.
All right, we had a lively discussion, lots of different levels, a great group. Our first point was people need a reason for why they or others get diabetes. So we need something to blame here. So we need a myth-busting effort. We need to decide how we want to position the message from this standpoint in sort of media output. And it's just not personal behavior. We came up with a graph that really sort of shows 3 different areas of personal behavior: personal genetics and social determinants of health. And that kind of message these vary by people's, different, but it's not just personal behavior. And so we need to get that message across to reduce stigma. And then the last bit, there is a place to go. No matter what your genetics are or your social determinants of health are, you do have some choices. And how do we set that up so that people have personal tailored health choices that outfits like diaTribe and others, other companies out there and governments and health can address, so that people know what to do and reduce stigma in a concerted effort. So that's anyone else want to add from the group we were in?
Thanks, Dennis. Emily wanted to share something. Go ahead, Emily.
Yeah, so I was in the asparagus group, which was a powerhouse group, and we had a lot of healthcare providers or people who came with a provider perspective, which I thought was a great conversation, especially given the results of, I believe it was the first poll, that sort of the 2 biggest areas that came out on top in terms of areas in which diabetes stigma needs to be addressed the most is medical professionals, and then people who don't have a connection to someone with diabetes. So as some other groups have said, avoiding crisis was something that was a bit surprising to many of us as ways in which we need to reframe our conversations. But most of us in the group sort of made a point that we would be changing our narratives when we're talking in presentations, etc. And then we also were talking about, we liked the frame of talk about what we all need to be healthy. And so every single person needs, access to healthy food, et cetera, et cetera. And people with diabetes need those things as well. And rather than framing sort of people with diabetes as, you know, special needs, underlying that every single person needs access to healthcare and that people with diabetes are no different in that. So I added a little bit more in the chat, but would anyone else from my group like to add?
So I think an important point was made that we sort of took ownership of the fact that, as healthcare providers, we need to be cognizant that we need to reframe the way that we talk about some of these things, picking up on the very powerful point that Jim Gavin made, last night. And we need to help our, those of us who are involved in the diabetes community need to help our, colleagues and, primary care, what have you, who are feeling much more overwhelmed, by how complex and complicated and overwhelming, diabetes is. And some of us to even think about whether we can't, impact the training curriculums so that providers understand that there can be some utility in reviewing with patients when we're in the room with them, how do they have access to the basic, foundations that are needed for, healthy living.
I want to make a little space for Marisa to chime in on what you're hearing and reading and any reflections from the framing expert here.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's interesting the extent to which the focus overlapped between the different groups. So it's sort of people honed in on. I think that the we language that goes with the talking about all of us is so important. And, I don't ever want to overstate the fact that people with diabetes are, they're just like us, which always makes me think of the Us magazine. Because obviously when you have diabetes, there's things that you need that other people don't need, right? Like insulin, but it's still a problem or an issue of like all of us are involved in it. And I really like the idea of care and there being sort of different types of care that are all interwoven. So there's people with diabetes who need to care for themselves. There's medical, people in the medical field that are caregivers, parents, and all of us who need to care about this particular issue because it affects all of us in one way or another. And that's such an important part of the messaging as opposed to just sort of like, oh, and then there's those people over there who made bad choices. It sounds like the crisis messaging has also been kind of challenging. And so I'm excited to see that different groups really thought it through, like how do we do this and make it clear that this is an urgent problem and that we see it as a crisis as people who are involved in it day to day, and see stigma as a crisis that's really preventing people from getting the care that they need. But then thinking of this also as not just a problem of, people with diabetes getting care, it's a problem of communications. And how do we make sure that everything that we do when we communicate helps reduce stigma and ultimately changes attitudes and helps people get better care. So the fact that all of you are sort of moving into these more complex directions with some of the frames is really, really fascinating and fun to watch. I am sort of guessing I'm wondering what are the things that people just went, I don't even know, I'm not sure what I should be doing with that. Maybe there's nothing, which would be fantastic, but that would be rare. In terms of whenever I've taught framing before, if there's things that people are just like, I'm not sure. I have a lot more questions about that.
David, I think you have your hand up again.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It was not in response to Marisa, but I will respond to that thought, right? Of first of all, to have this umbrella, like this idea of caring and togetherness, but also we didn't really get to time-wise address it in our group, but I do think this notion of different audiences is going to become really important too, right? So if we can have an umbrella, something that holds it together, and at the same time allows, for example, like if you want to have a policy conversation, as much as we'd like to think otherwise, usually caring is not your answer, right? You're going to have to speak language, but the fact that we all care does lend itself also to the systemic change conversation, cost conversation. Like we all care because this is impacting, Medicare budgets. This is impacting Medicaid budgets. This is impacting, overtaxed primary care, right? So there's a variety of ways to think about caring and starting to move that message out to different communities that I think include some of our hard data, some of our financial conversations, which wasn't the focus of our group, but I think is still a valuable language for us to speak. And to date, that language, I think, has been caught in poor frames, right?
Yeah, that connects, David, with a question that just came in the chat around what have we learned from research in terms of how to frame in a way to engage those who aren't already part of the diabetes community. And that was a question I was curious to see if Marisa was able to offer any insights on. And I know others have research background here too. So if other researchers have thoughts, chime in.
Yeah, so I guess so quickly to David's point, with the audiences, these are things these messages, you want to, keep the core of the frame, but different audiences have different particular languages and they have different, what is the term that I'm looking for? They have different professional sort of things that they're committed to, right? Like structures that they're working in or priorities that they have. So figuring out how to do that framing with those audiences is really important. And you all know those audiences much better than I do. So that I admit that takes a lot of work on your part to figure out how do I do this, and it's important. In terms of how do you do this for people outside the diabetes community? So the research base for all of this is with members of the public. So these are frames that we know work for a broad cross-section of everyday people who are most likely not involved in the diabetes community. So you can almost think of a lot of this framing recommendations as a baseline, right? So we know that these kinds of messages work for just everyday people, and they work across the different demographic groups because that's what we test for in our quantitative surveys. So I see the framing as actually in many ways initially designed for people who are not involved with diabetes, and then should be taken and customized to the different groups that are really involved, like medical professionals, policymakers, et cetera.